Welcome back to Seek Strength. Welcome back to Seekistan, back with more rugby S&C content. And today we're looking at some of the S&C clips, some of the sports psychology, and some of the skill-specific stuff in the new Netflix documentary, the F1 Drive to Survive version for rugby, which is the Six Nations full contact, and then followed, thankfully, Ireland's lead up, among other some inconsequential teams, to the win of Six Nations for Ireland. And we've got a couple of different clips in this. And the first one, we're starting off with the Irish prop Andrew Porter.
Morning. And then I remembered I just got smashed in the nose the night before. So.
What did you say you were squatting there?
It's 240. 2 times my body weight. Some days I go heavier.
Coming in with some pretty massive low bar back squats. Now, we already knew Andrew Porter had some pretty big back squats coming into this, and the clips in this are quite novel. So we've seen videos of Andrew squatting 230 kilos for sets of 8. We're not quite sure what his 1RM is, but it can't be far off 280, 290, maybe even more. Now, Andrew is doing some beautiful low bar back squats, and to be honest, it's not something I would expect of a rugby player. Is it beneficial for rugby? Absolutely, but it's just not something you could ever hope to expect from an international level rugby player in their late 20s after a long career of taking hits, giving out hits, and getting smashed in multiple international games. So the style of squat you do for rugby is a little bit nuanced, and we've talked about this a couple of different times. We've talked about box squats, high squats, parallel squats, full range of motion squats. And for us, the gold standard, or the ideal scenario, is that everybody would squat for most of the time, at least in the off season, with a full range of motion that still obeys the laws of good quality technique. However, there's always a couple of caveats with that, and we've defended players in the past, maybe in season or in certain scenarios where the option of taking higher box squats might be the better option for them during that particular point in their career. Maybe if someone like Bundyaki, who we saw squatting to just above parallel box squats with 240 kilos for a couple of reps, he was moving those very, very fast and very, very aggressively, and he was getting the benefits in terms of power development for his position as a rugby player. Now here we see Andrew squatting very, very low with a very consistent back angle, moving the barbell really fast the day after an international game, which is crazy. Less than 12 hours later, he's going to a gym by himself and training these squats, training up to 240 kilos for a couple of doubles, moving them very, very quickly. Just about double body weight, what he said, so he's about 120 kilos, and he's moving these in a beautiful fashion. Now, why would full range of motion squats be the gold standard if we can achieve them? The reason we say if you can achieve them, because in rugby, as many of you know watching this probably play rugby, that is not always possible, especially as international rugby players, especially as you get older. If you haven't ever had that full range of motion and that capacity to train full range of motion squats, it just might not be realistic in an acute time frame without the assistance of knowledgeable coaches to get to that position over a reasonably short period of time. You might need months or years. You know, if you're in your early 30s after potentially 20, 25 years of playing rugby, and if you haven't been doing smart, intelligent, progressive S&C, which you possibly haven't, at that stage, learning a full range of motion squat that equals your kind of above parallel squats is going to be pretty difficult to master. However, if you can do that from a young age, in which we see Andrew Porter has obviously had some very, very good coaching in that, we get benefits to full range of motion for the muscles. So full range of motion for strength is hugely beneficial. We also have specific range of motion which he trains. So if we're looking at that kind of sprinting angles, or maybe if you wanted to take it to an angle during a scrum, he's still training that through that full range of motion. So he's covering all of his benefits. He is developing his capacity to run a little bit faster. He's training the stretch shortening reflex. So as he squats deep and in fast speeds, he's getting the benefits of that. He's getting benefits to his tendons and ligaments through all his lower body. So we're getting these tendons and ligaments elongated during that stretch shortening cycle, which is one of the things that tendons really enjoy, is relatively or high speeds. It's one of the aspects that trains them. The other aspects then we see training them, which we'll see later, is some slower speeds at times. And then we get just this overall adaptation to his whole body from using very, very heavy weights over a long range of motion. If it can be done in this manner, then you are away for slates.
There's two other interesting aspects to this. So obviously Owen mentioned this is the next morning. It's roughly 12 hours after they've just beaten Wales. It's very, very rare that players will be going training on their own in these circumstances. So it is interesting that they have that kind of player autonomy. We've talked about this on the channel before, how important it is for players to have that bit of freedom to go and do their own sessions. But the other thing is he's still acutely injured. He talks about waking up in the middle of the night with nosebleeds. He talks about his ears still being split open from the day before. So it gives you an interesting insight into what that life of a professional player might be and how that might be different in certain setups than it is in the Ireland setup. So up next we have a squat from the English camp. This is a front squat. We're not quite sure at what point in the competition this is, but this is a very, very good looking front squat here.
When you're an England rugby player, you're expected to win. So have to try and deal with that pressure and that expectation.
So almost a full rack position. To be honest, in the sport of rugby, we don't commonly see players with a full rack position. Most of the time, they'll have to use straps or they'll have a crossover grip. Even just having the two fingers or the fingertip grip on the bar for the front squat is a massive move forward here. So it's a nice amount of weight on the bar. We're not quite sure what it is, but the squats are moving very well. Once again here we see full depth squats being used. So it is interesting, the kind of championing of the box style squat or the above parallel style squat in these high impact sports has obviously been going on for the last kind of decade or so. But in both cases here we see very, very good full depth squats.
Now, the front squat for rugby players is a very useful assistance exercise, but we generally prefer if an athlete doesn't use it as their main driver of their kind of leg strength or their lower body movement. The problem with front squats is they are pretty technical. They require a huge amount of freshness or low fatigue to hit good quality front squats. And then they require obviously a huge amount of mobility, most of which we don't really get in rugby players for most of the year. So if you're coming into the start of the off season, you're almost certainly very, very fatigued. You're probably very injured. It's unlikely you have that requisite mobility. Maybe you could train towards it for the end of that off season, but even then, the likelihood is you're probably not going to have a great quality front squat. One of the issues with the front squat, of course, is the loading is on the front. So this encourages us to, or gives the opportunity to maybe end up with a little bit of upper back rounding, missing the weights forward. And we just can't get heavy enough weights on front squats. Even if you're very, very strong, you know, if you're a rugby player who could front squat 200, maybe 220 kilos, because there are certainly rugby players out there who are strong enough to do that. Realistically, you can only probably do that for 3-4 singles in a very, very good session, in a very fresh session in that off season. However, if you're back squatting, someone can do front squat 220, can probably back squat 270. So realistically, we can probably hit somewhere between 8 to 10 reps with that 220 kilos. And in terms of sports adaptation, multiple repetitions with better quality technique in the back squat is just going to trump that couple of singles at that 220. So we're not saying don't front squat in rugby, but don't make the front squat your entire being or your entire lower body driving movement unless you have a very specific reason. This also kind of goes for the deserter squat. Deserter squat is something we've seen take off hugely in combat sports, specifically kind of wrestling and no-gi jiu-jitsu, and rugby a little bit to an extent. Again, it's okay as an assistance exercise, but really the king of lower body exercises when it comes to hitting all our markers is either a high bar back squat or a low bar back squat.
Up next then we have some of the Scottish S&C work and the Italian S&C work.
In the Six Nations, you're going to be really tested every week.
We have to try and get some wins. If it doesn't work, well then we're in trouble. We're just lucky we've got a player that helps us win games.
Interestingly now, when we're looking at this Scottish S&C work is definitely in the off season. They're in a broad training camp. I'm not quite sure when it was, but they're definitely a distance from the competition. You see the standard stuff being used here. We see quite heavy dumbbell bench pressing. We see a lot of core work, and then we see a lot of the use of hurdles, both probably for warm-up for a pitch session, but likely in this case as well as a warm-up for their actual gym session as well. So when we have players like this, the use of low impact agility pieces or the use of low impact running pieces in a warm up is very, very common. Now, the second thing we see in the Italian S&C work is barbell bench press. So it's not a very heavy barbell bench by any means, but it does bring up the interesting question of rugby players and the use of barbells versus dumbbells and their bench pressing. Now, to be honest, it's my opinion that it doesn't really make much of a difference. If you really want people to get much bigger numbers in their bench press, they're a hell of a lot better off just using a barbell, getting that large bilateral force engaged as much as they possibly can. Dumbbells are nice, dumbbells are novel. One advantage of the dumbbell, obviously, is that many of these players will have injuries going on, and getting that coordination between their hands and their shoulders is going to be beneficial for them. It probably won't have the same level of strength gain afterwards. They certainly won't have the same top level of strength from dumbbell bench pressing than they would from a barbell bench press, but both are beneficial and both do have their practical applications. Then we see core work being done by the Scottish team. Now, to be honest, this brings up a great point, and that is that most teams do mostly the same stuff most of the time. So you're not going to see any of the countries doing drastically different S&C work here. You might have drastically different physiques among those players. That's probably due to a host of other reasons, but their S&C work isn't going to be massively different from country to country. So most of the time you're going to see this core work being done in a group setting. This is likely due to the fact that it's accessory work at the end of a session. Most of the players, although they might have had slightly different exercises in terms of their main strength and power movements, most of them will be coming together to finish their accessories off. You'll see this across all of the countries in this documentary, across all episodes.
One of the clips here we'll see is some low block trap bar deadlifts. Now, trap bar deadlifts are something that are very popular in general sports S&C. And to be honest, we're not huge fans of them. There's nothing particularly negative about trap bar deadlifts. It's just that they're not the most effective tool most of the time, especially in the off season when we're trying to build strength, hypertrophy and other aspects like that. So the trap bar deadlift is very useful in certain cases. For example, if a lifter is maybe injured, if they are in the in-season, because you get a benefit of using a lot of weight without taxing any specific muscle group highly. So if we look at the deadlift, we'll get a bit more of a loading on the back. If we look at squats, we'll get more loading on the legs. But when we look at the trap bar deadlift, we're kind of getting an even distribution of that loading from the legs. It's slightly a squat style movement. The back is taking some of the load, of course, when we're pulling, but it's a slightly more vertical component due to the nature of where the weight lies during the trap bar deadlift. So in this scenario, you're getting a conditioning where during the in-season, presumably, if you're using trap bar deadlifts, you're loading up pretty heavy weights, which is one of the reasons where we get this kind of even distribution, and where the weight lies closer to our center of mass, we can kind of load up that weight a little bit more. So if you see someone deadlifting, very often they'll be able to add a huge amount more, 20, 30 more, maybe 40 kilos to their trap bar deadlift if it's something they train regularly. And we get this kind of overall just seamless sense to our organism that we're trying to load it up with some heavy weight and keep that condition. Because as many of you know, if you play rugby, the big thing you're trying to fight is the decay of your condition during that in-season. So your fitness, not specifically aerobic fitness, but when we use fitness in terms of sport and exercise science, fitness is related to your capacity to play your sport, and that includes all of those attributes. And so one of those ways we can kind of stimulate that attribute to stay for a little bit longer, we can't stop it during the in-season of rugby because rugby is such a brutal sport, is loading it up with specific and smart loading of weights. And one of the ways we can do this is maybe using some trap bar deadlifts to give yourself an opportunity to use some slightly heavier weights without taxing any specific muscle group. So hopefully you can slow down that decay of that muscles during, and your specific fitness for that sport during the in-season until the inevitable terrible end to the season.
Has been this perfect marriage for success for France.
Il a lui aussi, comme Antoine Dupont.
In that clip there, we just saw one of the French rugby team players doing some medicine ball slams. Now, medicine ball slams are something that are used wholesale all the way from the fit chick industry all the way over to elite MMA to rugby. We see medicine ball slams used absolutely everywhere. Sometimes they're used appropriately, sometimes they're used just completely irrelevantly, but power in rugby, or rate of force development, is something that is so important in rugby, especially if you're one of the larger players. You need to be able to move fast. Higher rate of force development, More mass, bigger smash. That's what you want. You want to be able to destroy the players as fast as possible within those rules we just talked about, within those kind of new, safer rules for those rugby players. There's a couple of different ways you can train power in rugby, or in any sport in particular. You can focus primarily on high force production, so that's just lots of strength training, building muscle, and then playing your sport and transferring that over into the sport, which is a very, very good way of doing that. We can focus exclusively on power training, where we're doing stuff like this. We're doing plyometric training, we're doing sprints, we're doing very intelligent jump training, we're doing our medicine ball slams, and any number of styles of plyometric or training where we are training that kind of power production, and when we can transfer that over then into rugby, or we can do a combination of these at the same time, which is probably one of the more intelligent ways of doing that. And medicine ball slams are very useful if we're using them correctly, if we're using an appropriate weight. Generally, a good way of looking at that is a percentage of your body weight. This will generally be somewhere between 5 and 10% of body weight. So for someone who weighs 100 and possibly 130 kilos, possibly 140 kilos, this is a very, very light weight for them, and they're trying to move that as fast as possible. It's all about intention when you're doing medicine ball slams, whether that's lateral slams, whether that's just straight down onto the ground. Doing these as fast as possible is the most important thing. So if we start using a weight that's too heavy, we start moving really slow, we're essentially getting no power training from this. We're getting no plyometric effect from that. So we need to be doing these as fast as possible, putting the huge amount of mental exertion where we're trying to move that medicine ball as quickly and as hard as we can onto the floor for however many given number of reps that you have to do.
Here we see now some specific skill practice. So this is interesting. The first one up here we have is the French working on their defense. A lot of the time when you're seeing international teams like this, you don't commonly think about those small acute skills being trained or really focused on by the coaching staff. These players are all professionals. They're all playing in really high level clubs all of the time. You'd think these smaller skills would be very, very refined by the time they come together for training camp. So the interesting thing at this point in time is that due to certain rule changes and due to certain focuses from referees and officials, we're very, very focused on low tackles and making sure there is no contact with the head. This is something that in years gone by wasn't quite refereed to the kind of stringent levels it is now. And you'll see here they're very focused on a active arm wrap during the tackle itself, so making sure there's no shoulder barges, but also they're really focusing on a mid-body height when they're tackling. So one of the major ways they get turnovers, the French team and the Irish team in the last 15 years, has been the wrap tackle. So to tackle somebody, hold them up, don't allow their knees to hit the floor. Basically then that forms an artificial maul around that. Once that maul goes to ground, nobody has to move away, and the referee will award a turnover in the form of a scrum to the defending team. Now, the wrap tackle is inherently problematic at this point in time due to the fact that you'll usually have one of the two tacklers coming in very, very high. So one might come in just below chest height. The other one's usually coming in at around shoulder height to wrap their body around the ball and make sure that player is held up off the floor. It's interesting we see so much emphasis being put on both by the English team and the French team here in those acute small skills, making sure everybody is on the same point, making sure everybody is refining those skills all the time. Now, the next skill we're seeing being practiced here is a very, very low ruck clear out. So this might be due to the fact that the team they're playing this weekend, they're going to have very, very good back rows, or maybe they have one or two jackal turnover specialists. But when you see something like this on the week of a game where somebody is bringing in a very specific drill, it always interests me. It always kind of ticks off or lights a light bulb in my head. What's the specific tactic they're bringing in here? Here we see Ellis Genge, a phenomenal English rugby player, coming in almost in a bear crawl stance to hit a ruck clear out simulation, and then he's flipping the player over. If it might be for some of those Irish back rows, maybe it's Peter O'Mahony they're preparing for, but it is interesting to see a very specific skill being practiced by a very specific group of players on the week of a game, probably due to some tactical advantage or deficit they might have.
Today we are training. So you've got massage, Emma's talking to you about your snack, your evening meal, your pre-bred protein. All of those things are in play.
Ça fait 10 ans que c'est comme ça, donc j'ai commencé à avoir l'habitude. C'est l'équipe de France. Enfin, c'est plein de petits sacrifices. Tu loupes pas mal de trucs, tu loupes des anniversaires, tu loupes des Noëls. Mais c'est le jeu.
Just gonna knock my confidence. It's how I get past that and put that aside.
But if you start to base your confidence on everything going well, we know that often people crumble, don't they? But actually, if you base your confidence on, I'm going to commit 100% to this pass, then I'm going to commit 100% to this tackle, then I'm going to commit, and you just keep doing that through the game, you can't have a bad game really yourself.
Yeah.
So there's some interesting contrast here in the sports psych interventions that might be going on in different teams. Most of us have an idea of what sports psychologists might do. Most of us might have had some interaction with sports psychology over the course of our training career. But here we see three very, very different approaches. And it's worth saying now at this point, these are just snapshots into the week. This is the day that the filming crew happened to be at the training camp or whatever it is. It's very likely there's a combination of different interventions going on with all the teams. But up first, we have the French mindfulness session. So it's very interesting. It looks like there's multiple stations set up around a large room. It looks like there's multiple sports psychs kind of on the go at the same time. Some players are meeting with them one-on-one. Some players are meeting with them in pods. Some players are at the back of the room just lifting weights, not doing anything in it. So it is a very interesting... That word autonomy comes up again. I wonder, is it a case where a player just decides to go on their own, or maybe the coaching staff kind of reach out to them and say, I think you need to work on X, Y, and Z, or your concentration or your focus isn't as good. Maybe talk to this person about it. Now, we see the kind of complete opposite then in the Italian camp. So we see a non-native Italian working with what looks to be an English or a Welsh sports psych, them doing that remotely via Zoom. I think this is what most people would view the classic kind of sports psychology clinical side of things as being. A one-on-one consultation. You're working with very, very specific things. You're dealing with issues as they come up. Even in this case, they're dealing with the next game or what the next weekend will mean to the player. And it's interesting to see this kind of traditional side of sports psychology being done remotely via a Zoom call for somebody who's in a different country. Now, obviously in this case as well, this player didn't grow up in Italy. I'm not sure if they're fully fluent in Italian, but it can show the importance of some bit of familiarity with a sports psych or with somebody who's helping you out with that kind of thing. In this case, maybe them going to the national team sports psych in Italy isn't going to be as applicable just due to how relatable that person might be to them. Finally, then we see a very interesting thing. This is much more along the lines of performance psychology, and I'm not even sure this is a performance psychology session, but that's what it says on the documentary. We see the whole team meeting up before one of their sessions. This looks to be early in the day. They're talking about the intent for each of the sessions in the day. They're talking about their mindset for each of those sessions as well. And this is very much down the lines of performance psychology. So rather than dealing with issues as they pop up, or rather than this kind of band-aid culture where maybe you had a problem with some psychological element of your game the week previous and you just come along with your band-aid and fix it by talking to a sports psych. In this case, it's very, very proactive. They're looking at the process. They're looking at how they're going to attack each of those sessions and making sure everyone's in the same headspace for that. So thanks very much for watching. If you're a rugby player in your in-season, then go find the Seek a Strength app, get the free trial and look at the rugby in-season program. This is 2 days a week. It's all of the S&C programming you're going to need to stay healthy, stay fit, and have better outcomes on the field for the rest of the season. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere and you're currently in your off-season, check out the off-season athlete blocks. These are strength and hypertrophy focused, so you'll come back bigger, stronger, and more powerful next season.